Hey, everybody. It is I, Hope Giselle, Hope Disguise, and I am coming at you all this week with another episode of Can We Talk podcast / Can We Talk Live for those of you all who have my Patreon and will be able to see our beautiful faces. This week, I have one of my, I guess my mentors from afar, right? I have many of them, and this is just one of them, and they are Alok. Okay, so everybody say hey, and make sure that y'all are in tune because I'm sure we're about to get a bunch of gems dropped on us. So before we jump into the conversation, I have to ask the $1,000,000 question, which is, can we talk, Alok?
Yes, totally.
So a lot of people cannot see you right now, and I try to do my best with my natural lip, but you are like the lipstick person to go to, and like you always have on a poppin' lip. So for those of you all who can't see them, Alok has on like this nice red fuchsia blend of something, and it's just super dope. And now that I've given you praise for that, I just want to talk to you a little bit about a lot of the work that you do. I'm always so inspired by the things that you are educating us on, not just in the US, but like foreign affairs as well. I'm so inspired by the way that you utilize your body as a tool of activism, and kind of sort of are really unapologetic about it. And so could we get into a little bit about the things that inspire you and the things that kind of motivate you to do these things, even when the comments and the threats and all of that stuff are coming your way?
Sure. First, when you said $1,000,000 question, I imagined a spinoff of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with you as the host, and I am so here for it. We're supposed to be having big dreams during pandemic, so I'm just putting that out into the ether.
Put it out there.
Yeah, I think that for me, fashion and beauty have always been vehicles of political protest because I wasn't able to control the like gender and sex that I was assigned and all the stereotypes that were levied at me because of it. And so I would, from a young age, before I had language to say like what I was, I would express myself creatively. And I think that there's something really beautiful about nonverbal kind of forms of communication because they really show people where they're at in their own healing journey. Like my appearance can really show a lot of people where they're at in their healing journey. If you're able to sit next to me on a train and just like, oh, cool, it's another human being, then it's like, wow, you've really done a lot of self-acceptance work.
Exactly.
And then if you're like, oh my gosh, moral crisis, like they have facial hair, then I'm like, this is actually more about you than me. And I think it took me a long time in my own personal journey to realize that like most of the haters are actually projecting their own self-hatred. But once I had that realization, I felt so empowered because I was like, actually, I think that one of the most beautiful things about being alive is creating. And I feel like so many of us have had to suppress ourselves to make other people more comfortable. And once I started to prioritize my creativity over other people's comfort, the sky was the limit.
Oh. I think that that's amazing because I think that a large part of who you are, like you said, is a protest, but it's not even, it goes beyond fashion. It's about the way that you've learned to accept portions of yourself that society has deemed to be masculine or deemed to be, I guess, representations of masculinity, and you've just flipped them on their heads and said, no, this is however this shows up, and whatever I say it is that day is exactly what it's going to be. And so it's one of those things where wearing a bikini with body hair is a thing that you do, and you do it very well. Wearing, the different tones of hair if you feel like it that day, putting on a wig if you feel like it that day, shaving your head if you feel like it that day, are all things that are representative of who you are as a person, but not representative of masculinity. And I think that even for me as a trans woman, there are things that I wouldn't do. Like at the beginning of my transition, like I couldn't dare walk around with like short hair, or I wouldn't dare leave the house without having on a full face of makeup. And now I'm just like, however my womanhood shows up is how it shows up. And I'm not going to allow these stereotypical social things to dictate whether or not I'm woman enough that day. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of people, including myself, look to you and kind of sort of are inspired by you on a daily basis, because it's just one of those things where you're constantly saying, screw the status quo. This is how it shows up for me. And I'm allowed to exist in this way.
Right.
And so do the work on yourself if there's a problem with that. I want to
Right.
talk a little bit about the ways that you incorporate foreign affairs into a lot of your messaging, although you're in the States, clearly, and why you think it's important to make sure that folks are educated on not just what's happening on this side of the world, but what's happening in India, in Lebanon, and all of these places. So what brought that about?
Sure. First, I want to respond to what you initially said and say thank you for sharing that, because I think it's so many times trans people don't share those stories of how, even though we come into these not new, even though we reclaim these genders that have been stolen from us, right? Even if we have to check ourselves in that language, we still find ourselves being pressured, even though we're trying to escape from that pressure. And that kind of piece of that second life of being like, I overcame so much to get here, and I'm still gonna be policed into stereotypes. That's a conversation I really wish that we had more, which is like, the joy of being trans should be emancipating ourselves from other people's projections of who we should be, and we should be believed for who we say that we are. The end. And I really appreciate you saying that, because when I started to identify as trans and non-binary, I similarly felt those kinds of pressures, and it was really hard, because there are days where you just don't want to get harassed. There are days where it's like, I just don't have the energy for this. I have other things to be doing. But then it's like, oh, if I don't wear a dress, then people are just going to think I'm a man. And so then I would just beat myself up, where I'd be like, okay, so I either choose to get harassed or to be depressed. I don't want that. And that double bind is a false double bind, because the onus is always put on individual trans people to do harm reduction for other people's projections on us.
Yes.
When actually the responsibility should be on you to just leave us alone, like at every level, it's always on us.
Facts. Because I think that's something that I always like to flag for people, and especially when I'm doing HR trainings or whenever I'm invited to come in and do sort of sensitivity trainings for different corporations or organizations, it's just like, I want you to think about the privileges that you have as a person who identifies as cis or identifies with the gender that you were assigned at birth, with not having to get up in the morning and base who you are off of the way that other people are going to respond to it. Right. Think about the privileges, just being able to get out of your bed and wear whatever it is that you want to wear that day. Do your hair or not do your hair. Wear makeup or not wear makeup. Shave or not shave, right? And then think about the ways in which the folks that you are working with have to get up sometimes 2-3 hours extra to prepare themselves to make you comfortable, right? That is a part of the problem. That is a part of the thing that we have to fix. That is a part of the reason that you brought me here, to help you figure out how to better incorporate and how to better be a more inclusive space for people in this workplace. And it's always so funny to watch the people in the room as I'm training go, oh my God, I never thought about that. And then also recognize that they would have been transphobic, that they might have said something a little bit off, that they might have misgendered a person. But then also to watch them realize those things and then check them in that moment is really great. And so thank you for flagging that, because that's something that I think a lot of people miss, is that as trans people, as non-binary people, there's a lot of work that we do before we even step out of the door that has
so much
nothing
work
to do with us. That has
so much work.
to do.
And for me, I experienced it as really soul crushing, because I'm a very spiritual person, and I've been trying now in every interview to bring that up, because I really believe that trans people are magical. And I believe so much of the persecution that we experience is because of our magic. And for me, part of our magic is we're actually saying, this body is the tip of the iceberg, darling. Like, I actually am a soul. And when we are out living our truth, we're actually exposing the world that it's lost touch with its own soul. And so they're persecuting us because we are presenting a soul. And so for me, to what it means to be a soul and not to be a body, because that's so boring to me, like being a body is like the first step. What it means to be a soul is to embrace my fluidity, like is to look at nature, to see how it transforms, how seasons change, how water moves, people are part of the world and the environment. We're in flux, we
Mm,
change. And that actually there's a deep beauty and resonance to change. Who I am now is not who I was 5 years ago, is not who I
mm,
was 10 years ago. I'm living my ancestors' wildest dreams. And so when I think about my own transformation, what I also really want for all trans and gender conforming people is to just know that we are worthy of profound becoming for the rest of our lives. Like, you can change your mind and that's okay. But cis society creates so much pressure and so much surveillance, particularly on those of us who are trans feminine and trans women. It's
yes.
just like wild how they're always policing our bodies, always creating these kind of hierarchies of if we're real or if we're not, and what we
Hmm.
need to do. and
Hmm.
and and it's just gross. And so I don't blame, and I don't mind what individual people do to survive that. But what I just really hope that we can do with one another is look at each other and say, I see you for you.
Mm,
And that's not just an act of trans acceptance, that's an action of spirituality for me. And then I think that relates to the question that you brought up before about a global sort of perspective.
hmm.
So there's this myth that's being peddled in the United States that trans and non-binary people especially are something new. And
Mm,
that's one of the biggest ways that they undermine our rights, is that you read what they're saying about us and it's like, oh, this is just some millennial conspiracy, that they're just snowflakes who are making up these genders, blah, blah, blah. And that was really hard for me because I didn't have access to trans history. So I didn't know that like we had been there. And so I think a lot of people do internalize those myths that were new. And so as I started to actually do my research and to figure out what the global history of trans people were, I was like, hey, actually, what's new is not us. What's new is dividing billions of people into one of two categories. And then actually in most indigenous societies across the world, and in most places outside of the Western world, like in India, where my people are from, there's thousands plus years history of recognition and affirmation, celebration of gender variant people. And so I started to realize like it's actually hurting us when we're just US centric, because we can learn so much from trans variant people all across the world who've been here for thousands of years and oftentimes have connections to those histories that have been erased in the US. And in the US, it was, as I find in my research, it was a deliberate project of erasure. Because what they did here is that they criminalized us out of existence. I just read a book yesterday about cross-dressing laws in San Francisco in the 19th century. And I was crying because there are police photographs of trans and gender nonconforming people who were thrown into prison for existing in public. The police would take photos of them to make fun of them, and then they would sell them to the newspapers. And there'd be all these kind of fear-mongering rhetorics of like, look at this man playing dress up. And then there'd be interviews in the police records, and people would be saying, I'm not playing dress up, this is who I am. This is like in 1880, 1890, people knowing who they were. And we're not taught that trans history. We're taught that like this is some new idea. But the more I learn, I'm like, actually, we've always been here. We've known who we were. We've had remarkable self-awareness. It's just that we had to get erased. And why do we have to get erased? I think that brings it back to the spirituality conversation. It's because of our power. What did it mean to be at the peak of the gold rush Western expansion, where you see the United States colonizing indigenous people across the Western world, and to be actually saying, my body, my choice?
mm,
What that actually challenged was the authority of that entire project. And what trans and gender nonconforming people are doing is challenging the presumptive authority of so many other institutions who claim
mm,
to know us better than we know ourselves. No, we know
mm,
ourselves better than you know us. And that's
mm.
really threatening and really destabilizing for a world that thinks that it knows you better than you know yourself.
It's really interesting, especially with the climate of the world that we're in right now, that you say things like that, because you have, especially, and I know that you may not be a Black person, but I know that because of the work that we do, that you've heard some of the arguments, that you've seen the all Black Lives Matter, and you understand why those things are important. But I always like to flag for people that what you just said is very reminiscent of what we try to get Black cis people, and sometimes even Black cis people that do include LGBT folks or LGB folk, to understand that trying to tell trans people that we are confused so that it
Mm,
makes more sense to you as to why we exist is not okay, and it
mm,
never will be okay.
mm,
But also trying to create this fear around the way that Black trans women are taking away from Black men who should be helping the community, or taking away from the strength that we should be teaching young Black boys, is a fear that's created by the patriarchy, by
mm, mm,
white male privilege, to make us feel less than in the first place, to make Black
mm,
men feel like they don't have a place in society in the first place. And so if there's less of you, or if we tell you that being this makes us respect you less, when really we don't respect you as a people because of our own, our own beliefs and our own system that's flawed. However, there's nothing that you can do to make us feel anything differently, but we're going to continue to indoctrinate all of these things into your culture and into your community that make you feel like trans Black women are the enemy. And kind of remind you that you are less than. I want to know, from the outside looking in, as a person who is still a person of color, and being able to see some of these arguments that are being made against a particular group because Black folk or Black men or Black cis people think that they understand and know Black trans people better, specifically with a gaze on Black trans women, better than we know ourselves. What is your take on the best way to handle this as an ally from the outside, and how
mhm.
do you show up for us when those arguments kind of present themselves in your work?
Right. So I think it's so important to really speak about the specificity of violence facing Black trans women and Black trans feminine people, because it's just astronomical. Every week we're hearing
Yeah.
new reported murders, and we know that that's a conservative estimate because oftentimes this is misrepresented, misgendered. We
Yep.
don't even get access to folks' name. It's been a state of emergency. It's been an epidemic, a crisis, a pandemic, all of it since the
Correct.
beginning of the United States, right? And so for me, I think it's really important to always amplify the leadership, the intelligence, the experience, the organizing, and the power of
Mm.
Black trans men and Black trans femmes to have these conversations themselves. It's not my place to be having those conversations. What I'm resonating with what you're saying is a lot of those dynamics are similar to dynamics that I experienced from the Indian and South Asian community, where there's this misrecognition that we are just some Western import. So there's always
Mm-hmm.
this idea of like, oh, you're only this way because of white people. And it's wild because I actually feel like for me as an Indian person, coming into my transness was actually about reconnecting with my heritage and my legacy.
Yes.
It wasn't about
Yes.
departing, it was actually about realigning and
Yes.
then to be seen as an enemy within. So it's very different. And I think the severity of the violence is totally different. But I can empathize
Mm.
and say that there's this way in which there's no pain greater than an intimate betrayal.
Mm.
And I think that that's what's so tragic and devastating about so much of anti-trans violence and anti-transness is it often is at the hands of the people who should be loving us.
Yes.
And that for me as an artist is, I think, something that I'm really trying to work through, which is like, how do you hold the sort of spiritual toll, the psychological toll of an unreciprocated love? Because I think that trans and gender nonconforming people across races and geographies love their people
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
And that's why they're doing the work that they're doing, because they love. I see that in your work. I see that in so many of our peers' work. There's a deep and fierce and resonant love of like, we are worth more than this as a people. And I see that for what it is. And I think I'm going to continue to always do my part. I think the first step, really, when you're asking about allyship in this way, is to be very specific to say Black trans women when we're talking about violence in terms of murder. Because oftentimes the specific violence against Black trans feminine people gets abstracted to the entire trans community. That's just not the case. I experience a lot of harassment and violence, but it's not equivalent to Black gender nonconforming trans feminine people. And then I think the second thing is to really think about resourcing, because so often with anti-violence work, people want to just make it about the incident of hate violence, but not about the entire ecosystem that led to that. So it's like, are people housed? Do people have access to healthcare? Do people have access to stable employment? we actually need to create infrastructure so that people are not put in vulnerable situations.
Mm.
And that looks like not just having rhetoric, but also thinking about resources. So I think it's so important that we hold the LGBT movement accountable
Yes.
for not having the leadership and not resourcing organizations that are working for and by Black trans women and Black trans femmes. And then I think the third step is really in our own communities that are us, especially as non-Black people of color, is really trying to challenge people to put violence against Black trans feminine people as an issue, that because it's often seen as just an issue over there. And I always have to do this work to be like, no, if people are dying, that's our issue too. You know,
Right.
like we
Right.
can't just make it about like, oh, it's over them. It's a no, this is our issue too. That doesn't mean that we need to be the ones speaking about it, but it does mean that we need to be the ones fighting against it. And so I've been really heartened in the past few months to see, you know, with the action in Brooklyn and the action in LA, like
Yes.
there seems to be just like a paradigm shift where people are really recognizing like so much of the freedoms that we have as LGBTQ people are because of the histories of resistance of Black trans women and Black trans femmes like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major and people who laid the groundwork for all
Yeah.
of us.
Mm-hmm. All of those people. I think that it's important, especially to me, that I hear my siblings and my brothers and my sisters say things like, we have to be intentional about saying Black trans women. Because far too often do I, as a Black trans woman, when I'm invited to some of these panels, am I the only person saying, we have to be specific. We have to be specific. We have to be specific. And it's not like the information isn't there. It's not like people don't know. It's just that there has been this long lineage of us being looped in with all of the other and mushed into the people of color struggle. And I often tell people that I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with that term, because I feel that at its core, it was coined by white people who didn't want to talk about the ways in which Black people were being specifically affected, or they wanted to be able to use a term that kind of blanket statemented Black issues with the issues of other people of color who were not white, while still pushing our issues to the bottom of that. And so whenever we're speaking about these issues and whenever we're speaking on the topic of death in the trans femme community, being able to hear and seeing it resonate for my siblings and my brothers and my sisters that Black trans women are at the forefront of that transgression, or of those transgressions, is amazing to me, because it lets me know that the work that we are doing, it lets me know that the
it's changed
movements
the
and
world, Hope.
it's happening.
It's changed the conversation. It's
Happening.
really created a new standard. And I think it's incredible and important and vital. And I also feel like, you know, the crisis of so much politics right now is people don't know how to hold the both and. It's very much either or dichotomous.
Yes.
And it's like, it's possible to say, hey, I experience harm, but then also I don't experience as much harm as other people. Like we always make it a zero-sum game.
Yes.
And I see so many of us as non-Black people of color feeling like there's kind of like erasure and foregrounding Blackness. And it's like, absolutely not. Like that's ridiculous. That this is not erasing the kind of struggles that you went through at all. This is actually just being particular and specific. And I think that specificity and precision are things that we should celebrate, not fear, because they actually allow us to get at the root cause. And I think that's, for me, like a lot of what I've been trying to do about bringing up the word gender nonconforming, because I think a specificity that often gets lost when we have conversations around trans people is that those of us who are visibly gender nonconforming, who are navigating the public in ways where people are like, is that a man or a woman? The particular kinds of violence that occurs and solicits deserve their own kind of attention. And that's especially the case for people who are Black and gender nonconforming. Those kinds of compounding factors are often ignored. But I think so often people read a call for specificity as a call for erasure, and they're just totally not, that's not true, and we need to debunk that. And in fact, what I really believe is that when folks are saying Black trans lives matter and centering Black trans women, that's gonna be a liberatory politic for all people.
What I want to ask while we're on the topic of violence is that I've seen you take a lot of the violence and a lot of the hate that's been just kind of thrown at you and make it almost comical. I love when I see your posts that are just like, I saw your comment, I see your comments, and I raise you my fabulousness in the midst of all of them. What kind of sparked that? And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, please make sure that you go to Alok's Instagram page, because they are like the most gorgeous pictures of them with like all of these hateful comments like spewed around. And so like what I think, first of all, what's the messaging behind that? Like, what do you hope to kind of sort of convey with that? But then also, what was the thing that inspired you to do it?
Right. So, I'm just genuinely confused why these people are so pressed. Like, we literally are in the middle of international health pandemic. We have climate apocalypse. Like, there's so many things that we should be caring about.
Yes.
And people care about me having chest hair and a dress. Like, really? Like, of all of your priorities, darling, that you're going to wake up today and be like, I'm going to be spouting hatred on the internet to someone I don't even know. Like, really? And so I just want to reveal how ridiculous it is. And I want to actually say, how could you deny this glamour? Because I think for a long time, like, I have to be really honest, for a long time I internalized it. Like I got that feedback and that destroyed me. I struggle a lot from depression and anxiety. And that really, for years, really like made me feel disassociated from my life, from my body, because I just genuinely felt like, oh my gosh, like I don't own me. Like other
Mm,
people own me. Like other
mm,
people get to dictate who I am. I don't know who I am. It, it, and then art became part of my healing against that. And so also when I'm creating those images, they're also for me to look at and be like, I am powerful, because I need those reminders. And I think that that piece of trans art making often gets lost is we're not just making this for other people, we're also making this to create an archive that we can go back to and be like, we are powerful, we are beautiful. And that's why I believe, especially in trans self-portraiture and trans imaging, because so often the images that we have of us are images that people have made of us, not that we're making of ourselves. And so
correct.
what I'm always trying to do in my art practice is like, here is me as my fullest, baddest self. Let me also remind myself what that looks like. Because there are days where that feels impossible. There are days where
Mm,
that feels too difficult. But then I'm able to take up those portraits and be like, I overcame on that day, so I can make it through another day. And I think
mm,
so often we forget that like there's a kind of resistance to enduring as a trans person. We only think of triumph as like overcoming, but
right.
sometimes these things we can't overcome. There's just too much hate. So what I also am really trying to teach people with those posts in particular is like, hey babes, this is never going to stop.
Ever.
Like it's going to keep on going, and it's gotten worse. And I think that's something that I didn't get is in the beginning of my career, I thought that there'd be this magical point where it's like, you overcome it and then it just gets worse and it
Yes.
gets
Yes.
more and more and more and more
Yes.
volume. And so I think also part of what I'm trying to do with those posts is to be like, check in on your trans and gender nonconforming friends, because they're experiencing this and you might see them as like brave and resilient and powerful, but why should they have to be? And why do we just dismiss these people as trolls and not actually as people's colleagues, as people's bosses, as people's landlords? Like these are actual everyday living, breathing people who believe these things about us. And so
Mm,
what I'm also trying to do with those posts is to indict the world. It's not just about trolls, it's about transphobia. And
mm,
you need to be willing to actually, because we know this every day, but y'all don't know the severity of this. We've been blowing this whistle for years to say, we can't even leave our houses without people making a fuss.
mm.
So I think it's also kind of what I'm trying to do with those posts is just say red alert. Both, it's the both and, both we're fabulous, we're glamorous, we're powerful, we're overcoming, and this is a crisis that needs to be addressed.
Yes. So, for my final question, what I want to ask is that I found that you are an avid reader, as am I, and I love to recommend books and what I like to call like Bible verses of my own sort of findings, because I love to create little pieces that create my own sort of scriptures. What books are you reading? Who are you inspired by lately through literature?
Wow, I love reading so much. Like I'm such a big nerd. So it was James Baldwin's birthday a few days ago,
Yes.
and earlier this year, I decided to read all of his essays because I had seen so many of his quotes circulating around, but I wanted to actually read where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
And that collection of essays, which I think I have it. Oh, it's in a stack of books. I don't want to pull it out, but that was just so, I can't even, there's so many, it's like 740 pages of just Baldwin essays. There's so many times I just had to stop and be like, this is changing my life.
Yeah.
Like there are a few moments when you're reading where you're like, reading a sentence actually is changing my
Changing your
life.
life. Yes.
And I just feel like that's the severity of his work, is it just makes you have to, because one of the things that he argues so well is people create categories to keep themselves safe. So white people created categories of racial others, straight people created categories of gayness, cis people created category of transness to keep difference always at a distance. And what he's asking is like, in order for there to be liberation for Black people, for gay people, there has to be a renegotiation of your own self. It's not just about helping other people, it's about interrogating the very ways that you've come to know yourself. So I think that was amazing. And then I've been reading a lot of LGBT history because I just, I can feel, it feels very lonely oftentimes to be the only person who looks like you in public. And this is a situation that I experience a lot, is that like, it's this sense of everyone staring at you, but no one seeing you. And so I just am like, I need company. And so history becomes my company because I find trans and gender variant people for thousands of years who felt that same fear or that same hesitation. So I mentioned that book earlier that I read yesterday called Arresting Dress. And it's basically about cross-dressing laws in San Francisco. And I think that the reason I try to find those books is because I just need even like a photo or a name or an autobiography from 1910. If I know that there was someone there, it makes me feel more permissible and livable, because there are days, like I've mentioned, where it just feels like impossible. And I think history makes me feel possible, and it makes me speak back to all these dominant myths that were new, because I want to do justice to my legacy. I want to tell people I'm here because there were people who, when it was illegal to look like what I'm looking like right now, would go outside and do it anyway.
Yes.
And they literally were thrown into prison. And I was reading about people who were thrown into mental health institutions after they're thrown into prison, specifically just for wearing a dress outside. And they did it so that I could be here. And that fills me with so much conviction and hope. And that's why I tell people to read. It's not just to like get information, it's to get hope. Because when we read, wow, hope. When we read, it gives us the potential to realize like how transformable the world is.
So one of the things that I like to ask my guests to do, and you segued that so beautifully, is to tell yourself something that in 10 years, right, that you can come back and listen to this podcast. What is something that you want to remind yourself of 10 years from now when you come back and listen to this and you're just like, what did I say back then? What was I like back then? What do I want to hold on to? So what is something that you want to remind Alok 10 years from now who'll listen to this and might be in a different space mentally, physically, emotionally, and you just want you want to remind yourself of that 10 years from now?
Right. This is such a strange time and pandemic. It feels like time is just warped. I'm like, who am I? And so these kind of evidences of this time are going to be so powerful for us going forward, because we're going to remember that time when.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I want to remember is that despite everything, we found ways to love. Despite everything, we found ways to connect. Despite everything, we found ways to transform. And I think that relates to what I was saying about history, because history is often told by the conquestor, the people who colonized, the dominant authority, and they control the narrative. And I think it's so important to leave evidence to actually say, no. There was a hole in that narrative, and that could sink a ship, even the smallest hole. And so what we're doing is we're providing evidence, we're providing a counter story, we're providing a counter spell. We're saying we weren't supposed to have these conversations, but we did. We're saying we weren't supposed to live the lives that we did, but we did. We're saying we weren't supposed to come together, but we did. And I want that to be part of our tradition, and to recognize that we're making evidence to make futures possible.
And there you have it, folks. Thank you so much, Alok, for coming
Thank you
in
for
and
having
stopping
me.
by and blessing the children with all of your knowledge and all of your gems and all of the vast amounts of wisdom that you've been able to pick up over the years. And I just want to let people know where they can find you. So please let everyone know where they can follow you.
Before I let them, I just want to say thank you for inviting me and thank you for holding down this space in this podcast. And thank you for all the work that you're doing, the diligent, like, I can't, I mean, I feel unfair to speak about myself on this podcast. I know that there's so much exhaustion in this kind of work. And I just want to say it makes a difference. And I want to say I'm so grateful for your leadership and the leadership of so many Black trans women who have just paved the way for me, paved the way for so many of us. And I'm going to keep fighting until all my Black trans sisters are free. And I'm so grateful for your leadership in this space. If folks want to deal with my antics on social media, I'm unfortunately on Instagram a little bit too much. I've been trying to peel myself off, like putting those screen
Same.
times, being like, I need to be away. You can find me on Instagram at ALOKVMENON.
Yes. All right, everybody. Like I say this time and every time, peace, love, and hope. And I will see you all and hear you all back here next week for another episode of Can We Talk Podcast. Bye, y'all.